Pests beware, your fields have heroes. The Pests and Predators podcast is brought to you by Field Heroes and is powered by the Western Grains Research Foundation. Learn how beneficial insects fight pests and protect your crops. Visit fieldheroes.ca today.
All right, joining me now, it's Ted Seifried, Chief Market Strategist with Zaner Ag Hedge. Welcome here, Ted.
Hey, thanks for having me. Always a pleasure.
All right, it's been a while. Hope you're doing well. I hear the markets are great, and so we can just end the segment there. Nothing to or not. Okay, or not. There's lots going on. Let's start with, Ted, if we can. Let's start with corn. It's the big one. Let's start there. What's going on?
Well, cattle's great. I'll say that. But
Okay,
aside from that, yeah. No, corn has been under kind of a lot of pressure here, really in just the last week. And I think there's a lot of people really kind of scratching their heads on that because the contract that's really leading us lower is the July contract. And, a lot of people for the last a lot of analysts for the last 4 or 5 months have been talking about how strong our exports have been, how the USDA has been very slow to react on increasing exports on a WASDE report, therefore lowering old crop ending stocks. And by the way, we'll see their update on that on Monday. But, everybody's been kind of talking about how the old crop corn balance sheet could be getting pretty tight. And then go back to, mid-April, and we were just under $5 in July corn. Well, here today, we're at 452 3/4. So it's been a pretty epic slide. And a lot of that's happened just in the last 3 sessions. And July corn at one point had almost a 40-cent inverse premium, I should say, over the December contract. Really kind of showing old crop corn tightness and optimism for, bigger acres and an easier situation for new crop. But then, that July corn really just kind of imploded. So it's suggesting that there might be more corn out there, or that our export program is going to completely fall on its face, and we're not going to export nearly as much corn for the rest of the marketing year between now and the end of August. Which, by the way, I mean, if you go back and look at last year's exports from this time to the end of the marketing year, they were really strong. So it's really kind of a slippery slope to compare this year versus last year, because it was kind of counter seasonal last year. Maybe the USDA feels like this is going to be more seasonality. Maybe the market's now just realizing that there isn't a whole lot of interest being out there in July and August, which I don't know if that's the case or not, to be honest. I think the most likely scenario is the USDA is potentially going to have to go back and change last year's production and increase it. Maybe they cut last year's corn production more aggressively than they should have. Although I would have thought we would have seen that on a quarterly grain stocks report by now. So I don't know. It's a very curious thing because, again, the big talking point for corn for the last few months is that it's maybe the least affected grain commodity, or grains and oilseed, by the bigger tariffs, and specifically tariffs with China, because China doesn't do a whole lot of corn business with us on any normal year anyways. Right. So that kind of left people more optimistic about corn than other things. And then aside from that, exports have really been on fire, and the balance sheet has continued to come down and get tighter and almost move to a position where you can actually say, hey, the old crop corn balance sheet is pretty tight. But then, corn's just kind of imploded. So something's afoot there. Something's happening. We can really kind of only make guesses at that for right now. But the easiest or obvious answer would be that production might have to be revised higher, and that there's just more corn out there, and the cash market is really weak. End users do not seem really interested in booking needs or additional needs out in July and August, or before harvest, really. And so that's just got a bad look for the corn chart, and the July contract has really fallen apart. Now, you can kind of tie that in and saying, hey, with a fast planting pace, it seems likely that we're going to get these bigger corn acres. It's always good to get planted early. That gives us good yield potential. So you could say that maybe the market doesn't feel a need to bring in as many old crop bushels into new crop for a beginning stocks cushion. But it feels like more than that. So, there's a lot of things going on. weather is a big portion of that. The planting progress is a portion of that for sure. But it also feels like there's something going on in the cash market too.
Okay, so we'll keep an eye on that for sure. Now, on to soybeans. A question there, not necessarily moving lower. Why not?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Soybeans have been, for the most part, in about a 30-cent range. Have been very sideways for the last month. And so, go back to the tariff announcements, specifically on China, when we went from, 10% to another 10% to, oh, now we're at 150, 125%, massive, and they responded. We had our 3-day breakout to the downside. And then 4 days later, we had taken it all back. And ever since then, we've been very sideways. And I think if you'd gone back a week before that huge ramp up in tariffs and said, China's going to have 125% tariffs on our soybean imports, but we're going to be pretty much unchanged in about 2 weeks. And I'm going to say, no, that's kind of crazy talk. Well, that's really what's happened. And part of the reason for that is because the amount of pressure that we've seen on the American dollar has really made soybeans competitive to the rest of the world outside of China. So we have seen our export program for soybeans kind of hang around. It's not been terribly robust, but we're still seeing some halfway decent numbers. And again, it's fueled by countries outside of not China, right? So that's been part of the reason. But the other part of the reason is that we already do have kind of a tighter balance sheet for soybeans, and looking at lower acres. I think the market does want to carry in some of those old crop bushels to just give us a weather cushion in case there's any issues, like the longer term forecasts have been kind of hinting at, that we might have a warmer, drier pattern settling in for June, July, August, especially in the western half of the Corn Belt. So yeah, I think soybeans just feel like they're adequately priced for the time being. Now we've had a heavier day yesterday and kind of continuing on today. I think that kind of goes along with planting progress being very quick. And so I want everybody to take that with a little bit of a grain of salt too, because when we're talking about lower acres, right, and we're talking about percentages of a whole, well, if that whole is smaller, it's easier to make progress. And so the percentage can kind of make it look like, wow, we're planting more soybeans, faster than we ever had. Well, okay, kind of, but also we're not planting as many acres. So it's easier to get to 20, 30% in soybeans than if we were, say, trying to plant, 88 million acres of soybeans. So while it is true, it's just, the whole is smaller, so it's easier to get to that number. But the idea there is that if we are really rolling along on soybeans, at some point we might say, hey, let's just keep going. We have this tendency when weather is good and planting is going fast to continue on. And this year it seems like soybeans might get the benefit of that, partially because corn has broken as much as it has recently, partially because, if we're going to be planting extra acres, these are acres that we haven't done fall field prep on. Yeah. So the easiest thing would be soybeans. And again, if you're really rolling along on something, then maybe there is some extra acres. So I think that's part of the reason why beans have come under pressure the last couple of days, but also spillover effect from the pressure that we've seen in the corn market.
Just quickly, when we're talking about soybeans to China versus other countries picking up soybeans, like what kind of numbers are we talking typically for the U.S. sending to China? Like how much of a gap are we trying to make up if China's not buying?
Right. Yeah. So, go back to trade war 1.0 or, phase one and all that. The talk was demand displacement. If China's going to try to buy everything from Brazil, that means Brazil's going to have less to sell other countries in the world, that we're going to see a lot of that demand displaced and get placed back on us. It's not as rosy of an outlook as it was, mainly because Brazil's producing more and the rest of the world's demand hasn't increased enough to really offset that. Let's just say this for 24-25, and I'm using 24-25 because we won't see 25-26 world numbers until Monday.
Right.
So we'll flip that script next week. But for 24-25, the world demand for soybean imports is 179 million metric tons. China is 109 million metric tons of that.
Okay.
So, the extra 70 million to go around, we already have a pretty big chunk of that business already. The extra isn't really there. So, I mean, if we
Okay.
don't get something going with China um, between now and the beginning of the next marketing year, we're already into our export program for next marketing year, and it's not good.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, we could see exports drop. I'm going to say 200 to 300 million bushels for next year, just for the loss of that Chinese business. So I am worried about that. But the market doesn't seem to be terribly concerned. The market, I think, is looking back to the first time we had this under Trump administration trade war, China, uh, trade deal phase one trade deal. China ended up buying a fair amount of soybeans, right, as
Okay.
part of that trade deal, or trying to make good on that trade deal. Um, and so I think the market thinks that's going to happen again. Trade wars are quick and easy to win, apparently.
Mm.
I get a different field on this one. I really think that this is going to be a longer term deal with China, particularly. So I'm worried that the market's way too optimistic about getting a resolution to this. But who knows? I mean, it's very unpredictable. Obviously, the Trump administration's been very unpredictable. And who knows what China really wants out of this? So yeah, I don't know. It's tough to say, but my gut feeling is that this is going to be a lingering issue, and it could be a really big problem for our soybean export program for next year.
Mm-hmm. All right. Let's end on a really great note, and we'll just talk cattle because I don't want to talk about wheat. But no,
Yeah,
okay, fine. We'll talk about wheat. Yay, cattle! It's amazing.
yeah,
But no, we
yeah,
do need to talk about wheat. I saw a map earlier this week of the scab or the fusarium risk for a lot of the wheat grown region, quite high. That's not good. Definitely talking about some weather risk for the U.S. Growing conditions right now. Where are we at with wheat? Is there any good news?
yeah. Like you said, I mean, there are still concerns about quality and also, weather. I mean, look, we were 45% good to excellent on our wheat crop. That has now come back up, right? And so that's been a little bit negative for the market. There's warnings coming out of China that heat and dryness threatening their wheat crop, but at the same time you've got Russia raising their exports, so that kind of offset, or raising their forecast, so that kind of offsets a little bit. I just think it's really difficult to get something really super friendly in wheat, and especially if there is some sort of resolution with Russia, Ukraine, and more Ukrainian bushels coming back on the market over time. That's just not really very positive. And I was just doing my numbers for the new crop balance sheet, and even though wheat acres are down, I'm still looking at an 800 plus million bushel carryover for new crop wheat. So it's just nothing to get terribly excited about so far in wheat, unless there is a really major weather issue. But you need to see those winter wheat ratings start dropping again, probably get below that 45% good to excellent before we can get terribly excited about it. That's just how it feels right now.
Okay. Well, that's not good news, Ted.
No.
But that's also not a surprise.
Yeah.
And, for those, we love wheat for all sorts of reasons, but it's not necessarily one that we very often get excited about on the price side.
Right.
So, not a surprise. All right. Ted, I heard you're going to be very busy this week. On AgriTalk and other shows. So thank you for making time for me this week. I really appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Absolute pleasure, Lizzie. Anytime. Thank you very much. And you have a great rest of your day.